Sarah, we're back with our podcast again.
Here we are.
And I'm going to ask you a question, which really is the title of the podcast, which is, did you know your body has a detour route, Sarah?
I didn't until recently, very recently.
And so we're thinking, what is a detour route? And your body has amazing intelligence, like energetic intelligence, right? But it has this incredible biochemical intelligence that helps your body get out of a pickle or a log jam if it runs into the log jam. And you're probably thinking, what on earth are we talking about? And so we're going to piggyback on our last podcast where we were talking about both of us being in New York at the IHS symposium. And we were both speaking together, sharing a stage. But the session that we were both raving about had to do with the vagus nerve. Do you remember that?
Absolutely. Dr. Habib is one of my favorites.
100%. And we're just going to pull him on this podcast when we get a little further down the road because he's such a brilliant human being, just a wonderful human being and a wonderful scientist too. So anyway, we were raving about the vagus nerve because all roads seem to lead back to this one nutrient that we both are passionate about, which is
Choline.
choline, like Jolene, choline. And choline, it turns out, is one of your body's hidden helpers for health. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. It's going to be a lot about choline and the why. We'll go back and talk about the vagus nerve. We're going to talk about something that often is skidded by or scooched by in the grocery store, which works beautifully when choline isn't available and it actually helps choline. And what is that vegetable, Sarah? She's looking at me. What is it? It's red or orange. And a lot of times people say, I'm not going to eat that vegetable. It's a root.
Oh, we're talking about our beets. I was thinking betaine versus
Yeah.
choline, but yeah.
you know,
Stumped me for a second. It's
yeah.
the, irreversible, choline to betaine conversion that can
It,
happen too, but it
yeah.
also supports with choline. Yeah.
It does, and we're going to go into that. So, because beets actually are one of your body's kind of beautiful gems it can use to help in this pathway. So let's talk. Let's kind of get out of the semantics and get into the real topic here. So here's the issue that we're going to unpack, and we're going to go all the way back to choline and go into why did Amanda ask Sarah about this particular vegetable that a lot of people like bypass in the grocery store along with kale and everything else, right? So here's the issue that we want to get into. And I already alluded to it. Your body is very creative at creating detours when some of its essential pathways or processes are blocked. And you've heard us talk about the methylation in our last podcast. You will forever hear us talking about methylation because it's like the biochemical heartbeat of the body. That's how I explain it to people. And the methylation pathway or process or system, if you will, is so important that the body has a detour to ensure that it works. So let's remind ourselves, Sarah, of what this pathway does and why it gets gummed up. So let's just go back, talk really quickly about methylation, because that's a good on-ramp to why we even want to talk about choline.
Yeah, the methylation piece is pretty crucial. I liken it to it being like that first foundational row of your Jenga puzzle. So if we don't have that solid, we're building all of these pieces and processes on top of it. And then we might be missing a nutrient here. We lose a piece and we try and stack it on top. And then eventually, if we don't have that solid foundation, that Jenga puzzle is going to fall over and the game is over, right? So we don't want that. We want to support nutritionally really, really well. But the folate cycle is probably the thing I refer to the most because it's sort of a starting point and jumping off point for so many other things as far as detoxification and making hormones and neurotransmitters. So it's really something if we manage that upstream, we can do a lot of things really, really well. How do you see that present in your practice, Amanda?
Same, that it's almost like all roads lead back to the folate cycle. Because, and if you listen to our podcast over and over, this comes up all the time. All roads lead back to folate, because folate then leads into what we would call the methylation cycle, which is really the methionine cycle. There's a passing off. It's like two traffic circles, right, that come together and they have to merge. So to merge, you need folate to merge with homocysteine and vitamin B12. And then you can hopefully produce these methyl molecules, which is really one of the major points of the methylation cycle. And that molecule, as you said, is so integral to really firing up or facilitating so many pathways in the body, even particularly in your work so much with athletes, facilitating the production of creatine phosphate, which is integral to energy production. And we need to do a whole podcast just on creatine, right? And why it is so important. And I think some of the importance is being missed in its role in mental health as well. But that's beside the point here, right? So yeah, I would say that folate and choline that we were going to talk about are some of the gene variants that we see most prominently. I definitely see it in my practice, that we have to address those almost first. We have to validate they're an issue with biomarkers. Let's talk about that just a minute. How do we validate? How are you validating whether potentially there is a methylation or a folate associated issue?
I usually start with the homocysteine, and I know we talked about this during our methylation folate discussion on our last episode, but it's such a good marker for how that cog is turning or not turning. So that's probably the first one that I look at, and then assessing B12, folate. Choline is a little bit more challenging
It
to
is.
ask for a lab result, and even then you're like, well, it's kind of in with sort of the fat soluble vitamins, not directly, but like because it's part of liver, we produce some of it endogenously in the liver, but we really aren't getting enough in the diet typically to meet the need, and we don't make enough of it, so we have to get some of it from the diet. But choline was only found as an essential nutrient in 1998. So we're still trying to play catch up. And I feel like all of the, papers that I read on this, that, or the other health condition, really points back to choline and choline production and metabolism. And then we demonized eggs back in the 80s during, the heart healthy research. So that was a really challenging time. We just said, take out the yolks. And then we were only doing the egg whites and we were replacing it with something else. So we probably have a major increase in diabetes in the United States purely from kind of saying cholesterol is bad and egg yolks are bad. And so I don't know, you're a little more senior than I am. What was kind of your interpretation, both coming from the UK and in Europe and coming into the US and then practicing as a dietitian?
Yeah, so my education in science was in the US, so that would be my knowledge base. I always go back, and I was actually writing on a British Facebook group. We used to call them listservs back in the day, but Facebook group where, clinicians were actually talking about greenwashing and climate change and in an informed way. But they were saying, we keep seeing individuals who are not eating animal products, and they're doing it because they feel that animals are at the root of climate change, et cetera, et cetera. So it was a very informed discussion. And, I had jumped on and made a note. It's that we, in this world now, we want to eat consciously. But in the 80s and 90s, when we started to move away from meat, and this isn't about us taking a position here at all, it's us actually working deeply in the science and seeing the impact of some individuals who may not be eating meat that need to, but meat, per bite, or animal protein per bite may be probably the most nourishing bite you can have with the fewest amount of calories, which is interesting. So it's talk about return on ingestion, but with that, there can come choline, right? Vitamins A and D. A and D are integral to immune signaling. And you and I were talking about that in a completely different discussion here recently at the immune level. So, animal products are, which were being demonized, to come back to your question, particularly eggs and egg yolks, were missing for a whole generation of moms, dads, and kids. And if you start to track what we started to see since the 80s and 90s, an epidemic of mental health related issues, potentially ADHD, autism, I'm not pegging it to changes in, eggs per se, but as we get into the conversation today, and we start to think through the biochemistry and what we're now seeing, there's a lot of damage was done. And the diabetes piece I want to come back to, because what we're replacing eggs with, I don't know that it's, low fat, no eggs, cholesterol, you're going to up the carbs. But what I'm critically seeing in the science, because we see this now in our practices, it makes us go back to the science, is there's a correlation between vagus nerve that fires acetylcholine and hypoglycemia, or poor glycemic control. I want to get into that. It's an incredible observation, which would go back to, hey, when we changed the diet and we kicked out choline because it was quote bad for you, what happened? So just observational right now. We're not trying to say cause and effect. That's really important. But again, beyond the sequences, like what are we seeing in practice? How does that push that to the science? And what can we do about that? So we forever digress, right? So
I think too the cholesterol piece. I think the research suggests that only about 12% of cholesterol containing foods actually become blood level cholesterol. So it just begs the question, and we're looking at carbohydrate intake. I had seen a comparison of carbohydrate intake and like cholesterol levels, those going elevated more than we would like to see them do that. But then cholesterol also acts like an antioxidant. So we see elevated cholesterol and we kind of panic. But at the same time, I think cholesterol, when we see that elevated, is such a good measurement for the body trying to feed back on itself as like, hey, we need more antioxidants. We need more antioxidants. So we're going to make cholesterol to provide that to the body. And so if we just like think about it slightly differently, instead of going, how do we reduce it? And we're, substantially changing the diet. And yes, fiber is a great way to do that. And our fruits and vegetables are a great way to do that. But I think if we just think of it slightly differently, instead of going,
I
this
agree.
is so bad. And just going, okay, well, our body is telling us something. It's telling us that we need, to support antioxidants, to produce vitamin D, to produce, choline. So it's really fascinating to think of those things a little bit differently. And even non-alcoholic fatty liver disease is seen in choline deficiencies. And then we have one of our favorite SNPs involved in that with our backdoor. So Amanda, what's one of our favorite SNPs here?
Yeah, I'm actually going to come to. I just want to go back to one thing you said about
Yeah.
cholesterol. Well, actually, just shed a little bit of from what we're seeing in clinical practice into that. But you and I have both observed in our training, but also more digging into the science, that cholesterol is an acute phase reactant. So post trauma, post surgery, you may see, or post MI, I think, as well. You can see very elevated levels of cholesterol. So it's acting as a call to action or an alarm, or as an anti-inflammatory, as you said, as an antioxidant. It's a call to the body, hey, all hands on deck, something needs to happen over here. That is different, though, than what we can also see in clinical practice. And when we're looking at cholesterol metabolism, it's very frequent for us to see gene SNPs in cholesterol esterase transfer protein, LPL, lipoprotein lipase. And that gives us insights into how the body is transferring cholesterol out of the liver or sort of taking apart those lipoprotein particles. And once we understand that, we can understand why somebody's cholesterol levels may be altered. And we can actually get in, from a dietary perspective with target nutrients a lot of times. And it also makes us push over to going beyond like a standard lipid profile to requesting something more advanced like Boston Heart or a Cleveland Heart or a Vibrant cardiac panel. We're not promoting it. We're saying, these are panels we may look at. And that gives us deep insights into the biochemistry of what's going on. And oftentimes we have very, very healthy eaters who have uber elevated LDL, and it's coming from plant sterols. So that shows us how to manipulate the diet, right, to try and manage cholesterol levels, so to optimize them. So you can see us saying, genetics gives us great insights into how to help someone understand what's going on in the body and to redirect the traffic within the scope of our practice. Biochemistry that can guide thinking and guide intervention. So that's the cholesterol piece. Anything you wanted to add to that? I'm sure we'll come back to it many times. So.
No, that was great.
Yeah. All right. So let's go back. What was your question, Sarah? I batted it. I've got my pickleball paddle out and went the other way.
No, one of our favorite snips that you and
Oh,
I seem to really get buzzy about. We're like, oh yeah, like another
here's
connection.
another
So cool.
connection. So phosphat, are you ready, everyone? We call it PEMT, phosphatidyl ethanolamine methyl transferase, PEMT. And I think the frequency of this, I didn't actually go back and check the population-based frequency, but the frequency that you and I see in our practice is very high. Um, and I know when in the clinical space versus the sports space, right? You're working in both, but when we're looking at sports is clinical, but when you're looking at clients who come to us who may be not athletes, in general, they're not necessarily feeling their best, right? And so that's a point we need to make. I mean, we certainly have people who come to see us who are interested, they want to optimize their health, so that's different. But I would say one of the most frequent SNPs is PEMT, phosphatidyl ethanolamine methyltransferase. And you might say, well, why are we talking about that? Well, it offers the detour route in the body. So when, as you hear Sarah and I talk about over and over again, we're seeing potential issues with methylation, which we are cued into through symptoms with our clients, is always the patient or client story that cues us in. But when we have the genetics, it says, aha, maybe there is an issue with methylation. So let's see if the body is optimized to go down the detour route. So you want to talk about the detour route or me?
Yeah, I can kind of dig into that a little bit.
Yeah.
I think so often, and in the MTHFR Connections Facebook group that I have, everyone is so focused on folate and B12 or methylated forms of those two nutrients. And the more, you and I practice, the more we're seeing a higher need for choline that is going to put the pressure on, getting that nutritionally, whether that is in the diet or supplementation. But if we're missing that choline piece, we don't have the backdoor, entrance into supporting methylation that can handle, homocysteine level management. So we've got our methyl donors, our methionine, which is one of our amino acids, B12, folate, and then choline and betaine kind of do similar things. But if we, are only focusing on getting enough protein with methionine, B12, and folate, and we're missing that backdoor piece to be able to manage inflammation and homocysteine levels, we may, get a hard stop. I think I think that's a missing piece for a lot of people to be able to manage their health in the long term. But it also goes into, well, if we don't have enough choline, we may have cholesterol fall out of solution and you've got gallstones. And I actually have a personal friend of mine who had her second child who had elevated bilirubin levels, which is not uncommon
Yeah.
after birth. They treat it with light therapy, which is amazing, but this went on for weeks. So we're talking about 4 weeks, 5, 6 weeks later, he still has elevated bilirubin. And I go, let
Hmm.
me look at your genes again. So I pulled hers up as mom, she's breastfeeding. And I go, oh, you've got a couple of PEMT snips. I said, and she eats, eggs and, that's not a problem. But when you're breastfeeding, lactation and pregnancy substantially increases the needs further, which I think was also a connection for my own postpartum
Exactly.
story. Whereas, like, I'm breastfeeding, I'm postpartum, healing from, growing a human. Your choline needs are way higher. Choline is not required in a prenatal vitamin as of right now. And so
Wow.
if women are taking a prenatal and thinking like, oh, everything's going to be fine, and then they're hitting that hard stop. But to go back to this, new infant, I was like, add a little choline supplement. So she did. And within days,
Hmm.
his bilirubin had normalized, and so she goes back to the pediatrician and normal bilirubin levels, and he goes, "What did you do?"
I just added
Like,
an essential nutrient that my body was screaming for.
isn't that wild?
Yeah. Yeah. And it shows up differently in adults. I can see elevated bilirubin. It can be a bile acid synthesis issue, or which,
Hmm.
choline is integral to, or phosphatidylcholine, or a bile flow issue. So, yeah, choline is probably one of the most least understood, but most inefficient or deficient nutrients that we see. So we want to go into just talking about what we also see when we see deficiency or inefficiency. But let's talk about what this PEMT gene does. So the body, we are all about getting choline from food. So the best source is going to be egg yolks. That's nature's gift, right? We start with an egg, if you think about it. An egg yolk is a source of choline and fat, etc. You can, if you look at Chris Masterjohn's database, it's actually really, he has something called a choline database. I think we can still access, or everyone can. He talks about choline, but he also talks about choline equivalents. So you have other foods that you can use, but are far less efficient or potent. So things like sunflower seeds, edamame, are also options I, suggest to people. It's sort of, it can help support choline as a nutrient in the body. Is there anything else you want to add there, Sarah? I mean, it's
Liver,
liver, yeah.
liver organ meats for sure are part of
Yes.
that piece too.
Some meat, I think some meats is a much smaller
Some dairy.
quotient. Some dairy. Yeah, exactly. So you're looking at animal products. If you're veering into foods, yes, excuse me, plant foods, but far less depth, less ROI, less return on ingestion. So the body, so you can get choline from food. That's the preferred route. And your body actually has a salvage pathway because choline is so important to help you produce these methyl groups if you need the detour. So there is a route. It's called the Kennedy pathway. I think the CDP pathway that helps your body sort of recycle choline from food. But PEMT is completely different. This is a gene we see a lot of inefficiency with. That actually helps the body synthesize or make choline itself. So that's how important choline is. And so it's quite an involved process, but the be all and end all is it's actually taking phosphatidylethanolamine and transforming that into phosphatidylcholine. And then from that, the body can help shear up membrane support. That's what phosphatidylcholine is doing. Hence why it's so important for pregnant women and breastfeeding women. You can see how important that is. They're feeding a growing baby, right? And cellular integrity and membrane integrity is critical. But choline, as you've heard us talk about, is also so important to another molecule called acetylcholine, right? Which helps with communication in the brain, so communication transfer between neurons, but is also something that the vagus nerve is involved with, right?
To
Should we
bring it
talk
all
about
back around.
bring it all back around? The vagus nerve, when you fire it, will fire acetylcholine, which helps with peristalsis. It helps with, moving food down the gut. It helps communicate between the gut and the brain, and the brain and the gut. Oh, we could go on and on and on and on and on about this. But in other words, choline, you see us talk about how important this molecule is and how we see the demand for it is increased in most humans. But we come back to this gene, like if you're a poor methylator, we can see that potentially. We're immediately going to say, well, what's your detour route doing? And if the detour route is inefficient, which it often is, how are we going to patch this up? So one of the ways is food. Get your stuff from food. Get your choline from food. So choline is one way that we can help shore up methylation. But you also mentioned when we were in the grocery store earlier, I said, what is that other food? And let's talk about that other food and why that's another way to shore up methylation.
Yeah, we're talking about beets
We're
and,
talking about beets.
choline and betaine. The nitrates that are in beets and even dark leafy greens are have a huge role with nitric oxide production, which also goes into the vagus nerve. So it's like the beets are kind of like a magical PEMT supporter
They
from
are.
multiple fronts. So yeah, is it something else that you had in mind that you wanted to add to
Yeah,
that?
so beets, when you think beets, so we've gone the choline route, but beets are also a source of betaine, and betaine is code name for trimethylglycine. TMG. And so the body is able to basically use that molecule in beets as a methyl donor as well. So that's where we wanted to go with that. Your body also has a gene called BHMT. That's, my goodness, betaine homocysteine methyltransferase that can actually, that's also involved in taking choline and extracting those methyl groups from choline as well. So the body can make choline. BHMT will then kind of get involved and say, okay, let's extract that methyl molecule, a contingent from choline, so you can drive the methylation cycle. So the detour route is choline plus this gene BHMT, or you can eat beets or anything from the Chenopodiaceae family. That's where beets belong. They're a source of betaine, which is a source of methyl groups, trimethylglycine. So some of these lowly foods, that we bypass in the store are, if I were to say, what's some of the most important foods to put in your grocery cart? You're going to be all your crucifers, which we'll talk ad nauseum about, but these backup foods are beets, and members of that same family, so Swiss chard, quinoa is in there, amaranth, and also some of the demonized grains, unfortunately, wheat and rye. And wheats can mean whole, ancient grains. So you can see there's this sort of connection, but they are sources of betaine or trimethylglycine, which if you think about it, Sarah, in our modern world, that's also something people aren't eating. We're not eating ancient grains because of gluten intolerance, wherever that has come from. And some of it is genetic, of course. It's totally recognize that. But now we're also missing organ meats. Some people aren't eating meats. Can you see how you're missing methyl donors? And how integral they are to, what did you say? Energy production, detoxification, brain hormone, not only synthesis, but breaking down like brain hormones, dopamine, serotonin, making things like CoQ10. You can't do this without methylation, and yet we're missing these foods. So,
I'll add
yeah.
muscle repair, for my athletes, recovery and muscle repair is heavily involved if we've got PEMT, going on. But I also had seen a paper about choline supporting remyelination for MS patients. So again,
100%.
that points back to that B12 piece. And are we, supporting all of the nutrients that are involved in the folate cycle that go into making new cells that work and
Yeah,
repairing.
no, and it's so interesting because I think even in our earlier education in nutrition science, or even when we may be talking, we go and see our doctors or whatever, um, we're looking at B12 levels and folate, but the conversation is actually not about supporting these key internal intimate processes in the body. It may be about, oh, you have anemia, or maybe you have anemia, therefore we need a B12 supplement. You and I look at it and say, you need B12 for reasons beyond neurological or beyond these low hanging fruit. Anemia plays a role there, but your vagus nerve is not efficient without B12 and choline. It can't do its job, or the target it has, it can't reach. It's a fascinating discussion. So let's just talk food one moment, Sarah. Like with people who are, I can't eat beets, and how can we help people who say, I'm afraid of beets, usually because they were boiled or they're on a salad bar and horribly distasteful or came out of a can? Do you have any, do
I
you
mean,
have
I did
any?
not grow up eating beets, so it was never something that we served for meals. So I am new to beets as well. And I think I've enjoyed salads that have like goat cheese and
Mhm.
arugula or spinach, maybe some like walnuts or
Yes.
pine nuts or something like that, like tossed together with like a lemon juice, olive oil, simple vinaigrette
Hmm.
is they're sweet, and you
They
can
are
thankfully
sweet.
you can literally you can go to Costco and buy pre-made beets that you just open the package and you slice them up, so there's like no preparation involved. But yeah, you can find them on a lot of salad bars, and if you don't know what it is, it's like this bright red. Sometimes you get like a golden beet, but they're super
Hmm.
dark red. You might stain your clothes if you're
Yeah.
working with beets and cooking or making a salad. But you can also, toss them on a pan with other vegetables and roast them together,
100%.
which with our CSA, we might get some more bitter root vegetables that I don't love. But if I toss it with things I know I like, and you put a seasoning on it, you can kind of cover them up, but still get some of that boost. Or, you can do a beetroot powder or toss it into a smoothie or juice it with other things that you do like.
Hmm.
So I know I've enjoyed like a Super Beets supplement, and the one that I use from it's like Human with a two N's.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
They're lower, in nitrates. I'm not sure about like the choline betaine content compared to actual food. But that's one way to do it. And they have like a cherry juice with it and some like
Yeah.
coconut water. And so, like, honestly, it does not have that like earthy, sometimes bitter flavor that a beetroot can have.
Yeah, and that's often what I mean. Some people genetically will not like them. They taste like mud.
Bitter, yep.
Yeah, they do
Dirty
taste
dirt.
better. Yeah, dirty. They taste muddy and dirty. But there's ways around that. And I was so fortunate to work with Chef Deborah Madison for a number of years. She's a James Beard Award-winning cookbook writer. She will always say I'm a writer, not a chef, but she's a beautiful botanical chef who trained with Alice Waters. I mean, it goes back to those days. And she's very botanically minded. And she says, you know what? Most beets just need some acid. They
Mhm.
just need some brightness. So if you get your Costco or Walmart or whatever beets, you're ready to go so you don't get the dirty hands. If you just toss them like with a sherry vinaigrette, just get a oil and vinegar or just vinegar, it will transform them. You had meant, and I like them, yeah, with like you said, with walnuts, goat cheese. They also pair beautifully with oranges. So that
Mm.
really lifts them. So you could do some, yeah, little olive oil always, right? That's like the gold or the platinum in the food world. But a little bit of vinegar, balsamic vinegar also lifts them because it's sweeter. So if you were to roast them, Sarah, like you said, and you're feeding two little boys, well, young men, they're not little, tiny anymore. But a kid's palate is different than ours. It depends. They have to get used to these things. But if you roast any vegetable, you're going to increase the sweetness. Then if you then, when you don't want to roast them with balsamic vinegar, but if you toss them after they come out of the oven, balsamic vinegar is inherently sweet. So now you've got the betaine, you've got the methyldonor, right? But now you've tossed it with something that's more palatable to a lot of humans. So, yeah, and then the other thing I do with beets, you see me do this, and you've mentioned juicing. If you are able to juice, if you have a juicer at home, you don't need the highest power one, but if you do juice, then juice beets and then throw in there some apple, so ginger, turmeric, like we want those potent roots. But toss in there some orange and apple. You will absolutely brighten that beet juice. And then what I do is I freeze them in big cubes, and that's like a supplement. So even if you didn't want to eat beets, this is a way to get the benefit of beets without eating them. And, that's kind of fun for kids, right? Like, oh, I've got a red tongue, I got a red mouth. Maybe easier said than done, Sarah. We'll do some experimentation, but there's nothing right having like a big red clown lips, for a kid and say, look what I just ate. So, or drank. Yeah, I know. So, yeah, beets are queen. And of course you can get the same out of Swiss chard too. It's still the same family. If you look at beet leaves, they look like chard leaves. They're the Chenopodiaceae family. So if you don't go for beets, then you got Swiss chard as an option. So yeah, and eggs. Well, lots of ways to eat eggs. Actually, and it's a point that Dr. Habib had made, and it's come up several times over the year for me, that the science seems to suggest that egg yolks that are runnier and less firmly cooked. And I'm not a lover of anything that runs in an egg, so this doesn't work for me. But, if you're a poacher or sunny side up, the choline, that is a more bioavailable form of choline. Doesn't mean say you wouldn't get it if you boil your egg or whatever, but the cooking can make a difference. But if you're like me, you will never get me to eat a runny egg.
See, I
Not now.
prefer a runny egg. I
Blah.
honestly, I do not like scrambled eggs at all. I don't, they get more sulfury
Yeah. Oh,
when they're scrambled,
interesting.
like for my palate. But if it's like runny, becomes like a sauce that I
Yeah.
usually will take like leftover veggies or
Oh, good
meat that I
idea.
have, and then I'll toss an egg over the top, over easy, and it just becomes the sauce.
I
And
wish I could.
I know. But I notice a difference. Like I feel better eating an over easy egg than I do a scrambled egg. And
Yeah, that's
so is that is that the choline bioavailability? I don't know, but
your
it was just
body has
something I
innate
noticed.
intelligence, and I think if you're cued into your palate, it serves you. And I think we've lost the connection with our palates. Right, that's so much of our work is to lead people back to the intelligence of their palates and biochemistry. So it wouldn't surprise me, Sarah, if you feel better. It's true. Yeah. What else? What else did we want to talk about? I want to chat real quickly about this, what I've just observed with low blood sugar, and it kind of goes back to you talking about in the 80s and 90s.
Yeah.
What did we, what hazards might have been created? But before I chit chat about that, because it's super interesting, what else? What have we not talked about? When we have you touched on it, let's talk about it real quick, and then let me let you answer the question. I said, what else did we talk about? But when we have choline deficiencies, how we know it's showing up potentially in pregnancy and lactation. But what about the liver when we're looking at liver enzymes? What are you seeing there? And it may be something I may see more than you, but are you seeing anything there when there's a deficiency?
Yeah, you can definitely have elevated liver enzymes or, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. The I don't see it as much in my clientele, but it happens occasionally, and we usually fix it, if it is. So that's the good news is, kind of assessing, doing a nutrition assessment to
Mm-hmm.
monitor, okay, well, what are we eating? How often are we eating it? And I definitely have clients who are like, I won't eat X, Y, or Z. And so it's like, that's great, but
Okay.
your genes are like starving for these couple of nutrients. Unfortunately, we do have to supplement sometimes.
We do, yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, but I think genes help people understand how they're built, and it helps them understand the why, so that we're making not an argument, having a conversation about the food. They can see why we are pushing on specific foods. In the end, it's your choice, as an individual. But at least you understand how you work and what your genes are suggesting you need. So it's a great point. But yes, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease among healthy people. And my population, I tend to be with an older population, so midlife and beyond. And as you may have heard us say, we love the PEMT gene. Well, guess which is a Kickstarter for that gene? What is it that hormonally will help activate that gene? Because the body's intelligent. And
I
the
don't know. Tell me.
Oh, estrogen, estrogen. So we see a different population. So
Yeah.
one of the connections, think about a double whammy. You are male and female. When you go through midlife, your estrogen levels can drop. We see, of course, much more dynamically with women. So you're losing an impetus to help the body create phosphatidylcholine, which it needs. So estrogen is like a kicker, it's like a primer. Then when you have a dud of a gene, it's like you're 0 and 0 or 0 for 2, right? You don't even have, you're missing the hormone that's the primer, and then you have a gene that's inefficient. Doesn't mean to say it's not working, but what we see is this correlation between symptoms that may show up as brain fog, or like you said, bilirubin, and we're missing a critical kind of input from a gene. So,
Yeah,
yeah.
that's super helpful for the population you see. I don't see it nearly as often as you do, so it's less of a, aha moment on me, but learn something new. Thanks for
Yeah,
sharing
you
that.
do, and you're seeing a lot more. So a younger population, and women who are of child uh, birthing age, or able to have children, or lactating, or whatever, thinking about getting pregnant. So many connections. So the one thing, let's just chit chat with me a little bit about this, and let's pull this to a close here with just some final thoughts. But one of the things that came up for me, and it was actually, I was going to say, it was a client that you and I have talked about, and I'll leave it right there. But this client kept having very low blood sugars. Like, wait a minute here. So having these episodes, well, she would call them a low blood sugar episode, so hypoglycemic episode. And I said, well, let's get a CGM, a continuous glucose monitor, and see if we can spot what's going on. And what came back was very, very lows, like 50s and 60s, which is really alarming. I said, well, no wonder you're not sleeping, or no wonder you're sleeping excessively, because your body is in a reactive mode. So what that led me to look at was to ask members of our clinical community, hey, how many of you are seeing this? And that led me to look at the vagus nerve. And the reason I looked at that is one of the inputs that came back is, what is the level of trauma? What's going on emotionally? What could have depleted the vagus nerve, right? I don't have the genetics yet on this individual, but I suspect we're going to see B12 and choline associated issues. Doesn't mean to say there's cause and effect. It could be that there's issues with the vagus nerve regardless. And you and I love the vagus nerve, and we can do a lot of work with the vagus nerve above and beyond nutrient sufficiency. So I looked in the science, and I actually just sent this to Dr. Habib yesterday. I said, are you seeing this too? So real quick, that there was a study in Nature, and we'll put these in the notes, Sarah, these studies, so people can take a look at them. And what that study said was reduced parasympathetic tone, so basically integrity of the vagus nerve, measured by heart rate variability, which you see all the time, was associated with higher HbA1c levels in individuals with prediabetes and type 2 diabetes. So there's a connection. They then went on to say, the authors then went on to say that while this study focused on hyperglycemia, chronic dysregulation of vagal activity could predispose individuals to glycemic extremes, including hypoglycemia due to impaired glucagon signaling. So what the be all and end all, and we'll just translate it, is reduced parasympathetic tone correlates with glycemic dysregulation. In other words, if you have like reduced heart rate variability or anything that's impacting the vagus nerve, which communicates gut to brain and brain to gut, has these systemic impacts. And one of them is hypoglycemia. And one of our colleagues has said, what is coming to me here is there's a vagus nerve connection, but I think it's more emotionally related. So anything that tones down the integrity of the vagus nerve has deep impact in the immune system. And here, there's other research we won't have time to talk about, but anything that impacts the vagus nerve and its integrity has systemic impact, including glycemic control. So you're seeing that from diabetes care, seeing it in Nature. And there was another article too that I looked at. But what is integral to how the vagus nerve functions is acetylcholine, right? I mean, it is that is so critical to what the vagus nerve does and what its output is. And you can't have, so the far reaches of the vagus nerve is to stimulate it, but it needs acetylcholine going all the way back to choline as a methyl donor for it to be impactful. And I thought that was absolutely amazing.
Yeah. And actually the last, yesterday or day before, I have a little client, who has a traumatic brain injury, is now on tube fed, and he's 5 or 6 years old. So we're trying to figure out saw his genes, high need for choline. So we're starting there first. But also, had some like glucose and insulin, stuff in his genetics too. And he has seizures. And so I found a couple of papers on, hyperglycemic, regulation associated with those seizures. And so we did a little bit of switching around with his diet, with his feedings, to do a little more carbohydrates in the morning, especially
Yeah.
right before some of the therapies that he's doing, OT and chiropractic and, neuro support therapies. So this is super new. Haven't, gotten to see any of the results yet, but it's just little plays on, the hypoglycemic and how that impacts the vagus nerve, acetylcholine function. Do we have enough choline, first of all? And now he's actually mouth breathing, might have sleep apnea. We produce nitric oxide breathing through the nose. So if we've got, lots of mouth breathing during the day, especially at night, or have apnea, we know that moves people towards metabolic syndrome. But then I also had another client, speaking of glycemic, who had AFib and a couple of ablations that just were not fixing this AFib. And she, in her genetics, had some glucose and insulin stuff. She was pre-diabetic. And so I said, let's do a continuous glucose monitor and see what happens. And what she noticed was that when she was hyperglycemic, she was having AFib fluttering. And
Wow.
so it was like, that was the first person I've ever heard say that. So it just kind of comes into play, like all of the ways in which, are we anabolic? Are we catabolic? Are we storing our glucose away in muscle? Do we have enough insulin to store it away? Are we accessing it properly when we need it? That there's a reason that, type 1 diabetes needs insulin. We can't make energy without insulin and glucose and insulin signaling being done properly. So, just a couple of little applications of exactly what you're saying that goes up and down that nervous system and
Oh my
controls.
gosh.
Isn't that
Yeah.
wild?
I mean, and just to sort of finish off, I said I wasn't going to do this, but I just, from what you just said and tying it together, like this was from 2017, Diabetes Care. And I'm just going to read what I noted here. This publication, so 2017, showed that reduced heart rate variability, which is a proxy for vagal tone, correlates with impaired hypoglycemia impaired hypoglycemia or hypoglycemia awareness, and in this case, in type 1 diabetes. And so the take home, and going all the way back to the body has a side door here, is choline's role in acetylcholine production supports autonomic balance, influencing both vagal tone and glucose regulation. Vagal tone stimulates the release of acetylcholine, which helps regulate insulin and glucagon, two key hormones that keep blood glucose stable. Good vagal tone improves the body's ability to balance blood sugar, especially after eating or during drops in glucose. So it's just incredible, just these connections. I know, like, it's sort of like when I came across this, it's like every day something changes in your practice. But here we have something, we're so busy trying to control hypoglycemia, hyperglycemia, and we're looking in the right place, but maybe using the wrong tool. And this heart rate variability, which is a proxy, as we said, for vagal tone, is really useful. We can monitor that, but we can also, even if we're not monitoring, there's things we can do to stimulate vagal tone. And I think that is what's incredible. We can use devices, but we can also sing, hum, jump in a cold shower, not my thing, gargle. What else anything you're doing, especially if you work with kids? I mean, they're kind of easier in some ways. You can get them to do silly things like hum before you eat, but anything you're doing.
I think even breath work, if you can get a kid breathing, that was, one of the things that my son did for his pelvic floor PT with,
Yeah.
having, he was having night uresis, and he's 8 years old. And so how embarrassing for him. But
Yeah.
the breath work, some of the biofeedback, and kids with ADHD won't sit on the toilet long enough to finish a bowel movement. So then you've got compression on the bladder,
Yeah.
and
Good
then you're having
point.
night uresis. So even sitting, having your feet in the proper position, elevated like your squatty potty, combined with, hey, spend a little more time to make sure
Yeah.
you're finishing
Finishing
the
your
bathroom.
movement.
Yes, yeah, but he within 2 or 3 weeks he stopped night wetting just from
That's
seeing a pelvic floor therapist who said kids are not finishing, who have ADHD are not finishing, and also
that's
breath
so
work, like that
interesting.
deep belly breath. So she had him blowing on like a pinwheel or trying to blow bubbles into a
That's a
glass of
great
water, like
idea.
ongoing. Like how long can you blow bubbles in this cup?
Brilliant. I
So
love that.
yeah.
Even for adults who like
Hmm.
just do this, it's so simple. Like maybe they just can't move. They're just demoralized, depressed. So that is something simple. Breath work 100%. That can be,
Meditation.
yeah. Yoga, like the twisting poses, again, that may be inaccessible for some people. It's not an on ramp, but it's easy and they can control it. Even if you're twisting in a chair. There was something else that came
The
up.
four,
Oh,
seven, eight breath, where
4, 7,
you're
8,
in 4 counts, hold 7 counts, out for
out
8 counts.
8.
Hmm.
And I think Dr. Habib said for some people that's more advanced, right? So you can start with just 4, 4, 4, like box breathing, in, hold, out, hold out, hold in. What was the other thing? Oh, it just went out of my head, Sarah. Oh, it can be more advanced for some people, but Qigong, there's very basic steps in Qigong. You can call it tapping the nest. Some people know what we're talking about. But one of the things you'll do in the morning with Qigong, you will actually, tap on your chest, you tap above your navel and tap your kidney area, your back. And it's very energy inducing. So I actually do that with some of my clients just to move energy. What they know, it's the vagus nerve of what it is. It just energizes. It's kind of fun for kids. Although I can imagine with your kids, the last thing we need is to give them even more energy than they have. Like, do not do this first thing in the morning. Otherwise, mom is like, what did you just do? But for adults who feel sluggish or they're demoralized or, that's a real simple one. So anyway,
I think
Sarah,
we covered a lot today.
we
Lots of
did.
good.
We did. It was, as always, amazing. I hope it was useful. We know it is useful for those of you who are listening in. If you have questions, just send us a note, and we can anonymously We can answer that directly with you, or we can anonymously bring it up in another podcast. Say, we had this question, let's answer this. So,
Yeah, it
all
might
right.
be fun if we get enough questions from people, or we could incite questions on our social media stories or in the comments section for a post and take on questions. That could be a fun episode sometime too. The mailbag.
The mailbag, Beyond the
Yeah.
Sequence mailbag. All right. Great chat, Sarah.
Yeah. Till next time.
Till next time.
Bye bye.
Bye.